Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and today on, damn it, I started that intro wrong. Let's do it over. Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and on today's episode of More Phases Does Not Make More Better, we have the Gigabyte GA-X79 Ultra Durable 7. Yeah, this is an old board. It's an X79 motherboard, but the thing is, X79, in my opinion, it's a fun platform. It's a DDR3 platform, and the great thing about extreme overclocking is you can extreme overclock literally anything, regardless of how old it is. It really doesn't matter. So I picked up one of these boards because I have a Rampage 4 Extreme that I've had for like ages, and I ran that board really hard, so that thing's kind of falling apart. It might be falling apart. I think most of the problems with that board is actually that the 3960X in it was run at well over 1.5 volts for almost a year. So that chip is like probably like most of the like that thing's degraded halfway to hell. But yeah, but that motherboard has other issues, like the postcode doesn't always work, and there's other flaky things about it. So I figured, you know what, it would be a good idea to pick up another X79 board to act as a backup for my Rampage 4 Extreme, and a friend was getting rid of one of these, and I was just like, well, it's orange, it has buttons, and it's made by Gigabyte. It only has 4 memory slots instead of 8, and it has way too many phases. What is there not to like about this motherboard? Well, a lot, actually. Mostly the phases. So yeah, it's like that's kind of the reason why I picked it up, is just like it's a cool board, you know. Gigabyte made it, made by Gigabyte. It's cool in a sort of like, to me as a like it has some collector value for me, because it's one of those. It's one of the it's a pretty special X79 board in my opinion. Partly because, you know, it's orange, partly because of the buttons. Another board that I would really like that is kind of neat from the X79 era is the MSI Big Bang X Power 2. That thing is ridiculous, but like that thing is absolutely massive. This thing's actually another interesting feature of this board is it's not that much larger than ATX. Like ATX spec would be if the board ended right there, and this is just a bit past that. A lot of the other boards, like say the Rampage 4 Extreme, are like way past the ATX mounting holes. So for like a flagship board, you know, this thing's kind of compact. It has a lot of phases. It's orange. It's just like there's a lot of things that I was like, on paper, this looks really interesting. So I picked it up and I made the very depressing discovery of what the actual VRM on this is like. So then, let's take a look at the VRM. This is the vCore section. So that's your vCore right there. And that's a 1, 2, 3, and we can count, and I'm going to count inductors, like, it doesn't matter. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Like, I know I normally tell people not to count inductors, but, because it's really easy to cheat with them, but here it's more convenient to count them because the phases are kind of all over the place. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 phases. And at this point, it's like, well, that's very suspicious. That's a surprisingly high number of phases. How on earth do they do it? And this is a question I actually spent way too much time with a digital multimeter trying to figure out, because this voltage controller right here doesn't have a public data sheet. This is an IR3567. Not a 3567B, like you would be used to on like R9 290Xs and every GPU up until Vega. From AMD high-end GPUs up until Vega, you would see a lot of IR3567B voltage controllers. But no, this is not a 3567B, this is just a 3567. And it's also not a 3567A, which would be very popular on a bunch of like Z87 and Z97 motherboards would use a lot of IR3567A chips. But no, this is just a 3567, and there's no public data sheet for this thing, so I actually have no idea how many phases it's supposed to support. But the thing is, this VRM does, if we look at the back of the board, have enough doublers here to be a real 16 phase. And I can't confirm that they, like, how exactly everything is wired up. So I guess what I'm going to end up doing is I'll probably just have to stab the motherboard with an oscilloscope while it's running to figure out what's going on with the interleaving scheme, because Or maybe just stab the PWM pins of the doublers to see that each each of the doublers is getting its own PWM signal and it's not sharing with any of the others. Because yeah, it's like the 3567A and the 3567B are both 6+ 2-phase voltage controllers. They straight up do not support as many phases as this has, but there are 8 doublers here, and they're all right here. Actually, there's 9 doublers total because there's another one on the front. And so those are all our favorite IR3598s, dual drivers with a doubler built in. So these can drive 2 sets of low side and high side MOSFET, and yeah, they can interleave them, or you can shove 2 PWM signals into them and have 2 phases and have 2 independent phases running off of each one. So that's kind of a neat chip, very, very common on a lot of GPUs and motherboards and just kind of all over the place. And here's where the rest of the vCore VRM is hiding, the other half of the MOSFETs, because obviously if you look at this side, then it's like, well, there's not enough MOSFETs for 16 inductors here. Well, that's they put the other half on the back of the board. And I have a major complaint for that. There's no heatsink on the rear of the board. So yeah, this I'm not a fan, honestly, of this. It's cool that they managed to cram a 16 phase into so little space because of the memory slots, but objectively this isn't going to run cool just because half of the VRM doesn't actually have any direct cooling. So it's a pretty major problem. And also half of the VCCSA VRM is located over here as well. So that's your system agent over there. Well, system agent power, and then you have your vCore. So yeah, kind of an interesting layout. And basically on top you have like one phase is basically that block, and then on the other side you obviously have like the other phase, and the MOSFETs would be sort of where this inductor is. And I assume kind of what Gigabyte is banking on with all of these inductors was that the inductors will actually kind of act as heat sinks. The thing is, there's really not that much space in between these for airflow to get in there, you know. I'm just not really a fan of this whole situation with these inductors. These, I think, are unnecessarily large. If you look at a lot of like high-end GPUs, you can get inductors that are much like, they're not shorter, but they would be a lot like slimmer, and then you'd actually have some like, you know, space for airflow in between the inductors, and that would actually make them kind of act like heat sinks a little bit. Like, not ideal, because the thing about inductors is they're generally some kind of powdered metal that's been sintered together to be the core, and they're not like, they're not meant to be heat sinks, but they're much better at dissipating heat than, say, they can help a MOSFET dissipate some heat. So yeah, you know, this could have been, I think smaller inductors would have definitely helped out in terms of thermal properties for the VRM, because there's really no cooling on the back. So this needs as much cooling as possible. And Gigabyte's heatsink for this motherboard, well, I mean, it has a lot of fins, sure. It just doesn't really have, like, they're not that big fins, right? Like, it's one thing to have a ton of fins. It's another thing when the fins are actually big enough to dissipate a reasonable amount of heat. And like, this is a heatsink with a lot of surface area. It's just too small. Like, for the amount of space it takes up, for like the volume it takes up, it certainly has a ton of surface area. The thing is, this heatsink could be like, you know, it could be deeper, and actually it could overhang the power, like it could overhang the inductors a bit. Like, this could be a lot larger. This could have a lot more, like, even more surface area than it has. And yeah, I'm not a fan of this. This is better than a lot of the fashion blocks we have on modern motherboards, but it's like it's not big enough still. I don't think it's not big enough. And you know, Sandybridge-E is very, very power hungry. So yeah, I'm not a fan of the cooling situation on this motherboard whatsoever, because you have half the VRM with no heatsink at all, and the other half that does have a heatsink has a kind of a miserable heatsink. And it just kind of keeps getting worse, because that over there is your system agent. And it kind of keeps getting worse because that's your high side MOSFET, that's your low side MOSFET, and the high side MOSFET is made by International Rectifier, which is like, ooh, that's a name brand company, that has to be a great MOSFET. It's a hex FET, and it's an 8330 for the high side, And for the low side, we have an IRF H, also a HEXFET series MOSFET, 8318. See, the problem here is that this MOSFET here has 0.0031 milliohm, 31 ohms of RDS on. That's not great. Okay, that's just, no. Like, for a high-end motherboard, I'd want a low-side MOSFET. I would say you want to be under, like, 2 milliohms, so 0.02, or lower. So I am not a fan of that. That is way too high resistance. And then the high-side MOSFET is, like, this is actually a solid high-side MOSFET. It's a bit high resistance at 0.066, but for a high-side MOSFET, that doesn't really matter that much. The main concern with high-side MOSFETs is that they switch on and off very, very quickly. And these do that. They max out the driving speed of the IR3598s on here. So that's fine. It's just that low-side MOSFET is really, really underwhelming. And the end result of that is that the V-Core VRM for, you know, a variety of currents that you might actually achieve on Sandybridge-E, because Sandybridge-E, like, it pulls a ton of power. And I love Sandybridge-E because you can, like, hammer a Sandybridge-E CPU even on, like, water cooling. That's, like, my favorite part about Sandybridge-E is it is just, like, even on water cooling, it's absolutely ridiculous. What you can do with a Sandybridge-E CPU. The sad thing is when you put them on liquid nitrogen, they don't really get that much better, if at all, because a lot of those chips don't even work below, like, -20. Well, some chips didn't even work below -20. Most of them would sort of max out around -50. So they're really awkward because they don't even run properly on, like, straight dry ice. So yeah, Sandybridge-E is just kind of like it's like a water-only architecture. Anyway, so for various current draws, so say 1.4 volts, 100 amps output, which is way too low for a Sandybridge-E CPU. Like, at 1.4 volts, you're going to be pulling way more current than that. But at 1.4 volts, 100 amps, you're going to be looking at about 10 watts of heat output on the VRM. And that's assuming 10 volts gate to source voltage, which I'm assuming Gigabyte is just driving the VRM with straight 12 volts, because having a 10 volt regulator really doesn't make that much sense, just for the sake of powering the, you know, for switching the MOSFETs. It's easier to just use straight 12 volts. It's not going to make a huge difference. 300 kilohertz switching frequency, which is just sort of your normal VRM switching frequency for having a good efficiency at the same time as decent decent output ripple. So with those two VRM sort of operating settings, you know, 10 watts at 100 amps output, and we're going to keep that 1.4 volts across the full range, because going up and down on the voltage, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to this VRM for overall heat output. It does get worse as you run more voltage, but it's not a huge difference. But anyway, so 1.4 volts, 150 amps, you'd be looking at about 16 watts of heat, which is still not that bad. The thing is, Sandybridge-E can pull a lot more than that too. 1.4 volts, 200 amps, you're looking at about 25 watts of heat. And half of that heat is on the back of the board. So, you know, that's a problem. And the thing is, 200 amps is really like that right there on a 6-core Sandybridge basically is like 1.45 volts, 4.8 gigahertz. Like, that is a totally reasonable current to hit at those settings. So this right here is kind of concerning when half of your VRM that's producing half of that 25 watts of heat is located on the back of the board with literally no heatsink. So yeah, not impressed right there with that design decision. And 250 amps, things get worse. The VRM starts to kick out about 36 watts of heat. And, you know, at that point, it's like, this might be sustainable because, well, not really. Because the thing is, these low-side MOSFETs actually have a really, like, they have a good thermal transfer rate from, like, the MOSFET to the PCB they're mounting it on. The 8330, on the other hand, not so much. That has almost 4 degrees per watt of thermal resistance. So basically, admittedly, like, most of the heat is produced by the low side, but like the low side and the high side MOSFET are so close together that, you know, the low side MOSFET is going to heat up the high side MOSFET, and then it's just like you can't push any much power, like much current through the high side at that point, just because the high side is going to be so hot from the low side being so close to it. So yeah, I'm really not a fan of the VRM design here, because it's not efficient, and it's really badly cooled as well. And then you go up to 300 amps output and it just keeps getting worse. So at that point we're pushing almost 50 watts of heat at about 49. And it, you know, if you actually ran it at like 1.6 volts 300 amps, then you would be looking at over 50 watts of heat. So that's just like, yeah, that's not going to work. Like 25 watts of heat on the back of the board with no cooling. Like, yeah, where's that going to go? I'd love to know where that's supposed to go, because with all probability, it's just going to burn out the MOSFETs. Unless you have like a fan blowing, you know, air literally under the motherboard. If this motherboard was in like your normal PC case and you had a really heavy overclock going, I could totally see it causing some major VRM thermal issues. So, you know, definitely, like, really not impressed. And then 350 amps, I'm basically, at this point, we're just going to see where does the VRM kind of fall apart. Well, at that point, you're looking at about 63 watts of heat. And yeah, it's just, like, that's just a disaster. Like, that's completely uncoolable on the back of the board. Honestly, even this would be very, very, very hard to cool, and it just keeps getting worse. So yeah, I'm not impressed with the VRM on this motherboard. Really, like, it's cool that they managed to cram a 16 phase. What's not cool is that they managed to build, you know, a 16 phase with, like, per phase current capability here is like, if you combined these MOSFETs together into a power stage, like if you had a power stage with these parameters for the low side and the high side MOSFET, it would be like a 20, maybe 30 amp power stage. Right? Like, that's not good. That is really, really not good. So the per phase current capability on this VRM is absolutely freaking awful. The cooling is miserable, in my opinion. And, you know, it's just like, more phases does not make a more better VRM. If each of your phases sucks, then you're going to need way more, like, like, that's the problem. More phases does not translate into a better VRM unless you actually have good individual phases. Okay, you can have, it's like, you can have 4-phase VRMs that completely outperform 16-phase VRMs, depending on just how badly designed, well, how bad the components in said 16-phase are. I mean, if you made a 16 phase of like these transistors, like, it wouldn't handle any power whatsoever. That's not a power transistor, but it's like, it's still a transistor. And if you were insane enough, you could totally build a 16 phase out of those. It'd just be completely bloody useless. So yeah, and this VRM here is just like, it's cool that you have 16 phases, but this MOSFET is just like, it should have just been a better MOSFET, really. And it's not like they don't make better MOSFETs. Like, I actually went ahead because I want to keep this motherboard for a while, because I don't know how it'll perform, but I think it's a pretty cool board. And so I got this crazy idea where I was like, well, it turns out that I actually like this board enough to, like, if I like the BIOS and just the overclocking experience with this board, ignoring all the potential VRM issues, hopefully enough airflow makes the VRM not cause any issues just for benchmarking purposes. I still wouldn't I wouldn't want to run this at full load for any extended period of time, but, you know, just quick Cinebench runs and that kind of thing, I don't think it should cause too many issues. But it's like, well, if I like the board, I actually went ahead and was like, okay, you know what? I might just end up replacing all of the low side MOSFETs for better low side MOSFETs, because, you know, it's just like, I like the board, and potentially upgrading these and upgrading these MOSFETs just was like, well, that shouldn't be, like, it would be hard to do and definitely not practical, but I do really impractical things in general. I mean, I pour liquid nitrogen on GPUs. So at that point, practicality and, you know, practicality kind of stops being an important thing to consider here. And really, I might just, like, I went and basically Infineon, so the company that now owns International Rectifier, Infineon makes like a 0.0018 ohm MOSFET in the exact same packaging. So from 3.1 milliohms to like 1.8 milliohms. And those will, like, they match the footprint of these, and they're not, like, they're also meant for power converters, and they should match up with the drivers pretty well. There shouldn't be too many issues with them. So I'm thinking I'm just going to upgrade from these existing MOSFETs to some of the Infineon ones that I found, because those look like they should be a significant upgrade, and then I might not have a problem with no heatsink on the back of the board. Theoretically, running the calculations with those MOSFETs in this VRM, it was like 200 amps, about 25 watts of heat, went all the way down to like 19 watts of heat. And then at like the higher currents, I think 300 amps was doing more like in the 30s instead of in the 40, like almost 50. So yeah, I'm definitely like, maybe, depending on how much I like the board, sometime in the future, I might replace all of the low side MOSFETs in the VCore VRM because they suck. And I hope I like the board, because if I like the board, then it'll be even cooler when it has like, oh yeah, I like what motherboard do you use for benching X79? Oh, you know, a ultra durable 7 with like swapped out low side MOSFETs, which is just like that's like on par with some of the other stuff. Well, that's almost e-power level of like modifications, and I think it would just be something cool to do. So yeah. Anyway, I'm not impressed with the VCore VRM here, but I'm impressed that they managed to get so many phases. Just sucks that all the phases are terrible. Now, the System Agent VRM is another 2 phases, so again, and same MOSFETs again. And luckily, the System Agent really doesn't need to push that much power. So for 1.2 volts, 20 amps, you're going to be looking at around 2.5 watts of heat. 1.2 volts, 30 amps, you're going to be looking at about 4.5 watts of heat. And 1.2 volts, 40 amps, you're going to be looking at about 7 watts of heat. 3.5 per phase. So yeah, that's for the System Agent. And is it an actual 16 phase? Probably. As I said, I can't get the datasheet for this, but there's definitely enough doublers here. So this VRM is an 8 times 2 plus 2, where all the phases suck. So yeah, and that's probably an 8 plus 2 phase voltage controller for the 3567. So yeah, that's the VCore VRM up here. I'm really not impressed with it because it's not impressive. And you know what's more concerning? So actually, well, more interesting and not concerning because it happened in the past, but Gigabyte had a bunch of other motherboards on X79, like the Ultra Durable 5 and the Ultra Durable 3. And I don't know why they have Ultra Durable 3 right here. Like, it's like like, what the fuck? WTF is up with that? Like 7-3? Anyway, they had a Ultra Durable 3 motherboard, and they also had the Ultra Durable 5, and they had one other motherboard, which I think was like the G1, I think it was called the G1 Assassin or something. That one was one of those like military green motherboard, like green military themed motherboards that Gigabyte made at the time. Yeah, they recalled, well, they didn't recall those motherboards because you don't like, nobody complained enough, but Gigabyte basically canceled production on those boards because those had massive VRM thermal issues. And for the boards that they did sell, their solution to the VRM thermal issues was to put out a BIOS update, which, if I remember correctly, blocked basically voltage control. You weren't able to change, like, set the core voltage past a certain point on those motherboards because the VRM would overheat. My best guess on what is actually on those motherboards is this VRM with half as many phases. And I'm complaining about it with 16. So you can imagine what I would say if this had half as many phases. So yeah, and Gigabyte straight up canceled those boards. Like the Ultra Durable 3 and the Ultra Durable 5, like they stopped making them, and then they released several months later the Ultra Powerful 3, 4, and 5 motherboards. And actually, even the Ultra Durable 7 and the rest of the Gigabyte sort of X79 lineup kind of flopped. Because, yeah, like, I mean, it's not hard to see why. I mean, look at this. It's terrible. Interesting boards, though. So, Yeah, and then on the ultra durable 3, I just assumed they had half this VRM because that's kind of what most motherboard manufacturers would do. You just cut down how many phases you have. You wouldn't actually change the components because that would make sourcing parts more complicated. So yeah. Anyway, let's move on to some of the other power circuits on here. So memory power is you obviously have one memory, like you have a two-phase memory power for each sets of memory slots, which is pretty standard on most high-end motherboards. DDR3 or DDR4 really doesn't matter. So you also have a VMEM over here. The corresponding controller is right here. And then we also have VTT down here. So that's so basically VTT and VCCSA are so system agent are like memory controller power rails. So if you think like if you compared it to something like Ryzen, it would be like basically VTT and SA is equivalent to like the entire SoC region of a Ryzen CPU, or compared to say Coffee Lake, it's like IO and a system agent. So this is what Intel had before. They had IO and system agent. They had VTT and system agent. Anyway, so you have VMEM, and that's a two-phase. VTT, that's also a two-phase split like that. So you have 1, 2, and then, of course, this is also a two-phase. The controller for all of these is actually the IR3570, and I do actually have a data sheet for that, and that is, in this case, configured. This one over here is configured as a 2+2 because it controls these two phases, or it does VMEM, right? That's controlled by that one, and then it also controls dodge the memory slots because I'm writing orange on orange. So it also controls the VTT down here, which is why this one's a 2+2, but this one over here is a 2+0. And here's the fun comparison. So here we have a two-phase VTT VRM, right? And the component used for actually making up each of those phases is an International Rectifier 3553 40 amp power stage. So how does the 40 amp power stage compare to the god-awful MOSFETs used in one of the phases over here? Well, that's a really easy comparison because, you know, we have this for the system agent, which is a two-phase using the god-awful MOSFETs, and then we have a two-phase made up of the power stages. So that's going to be a really easy comparison because I actually did the power stages are easiest to calculate at 1.2 volts, and I don't know why I wrote that out 3 times. We can just do this. So 1.2 volts, 20 amps output on the VTT rail. You're going to be looking at about 2.5 watts. So the same as for the god-awful MOSFETs. And then 30 amps, you're going to be looking at 3.5. A 1 watt advantage for the 40 amp power stages. And it gets worse because at 40 amps output, these guys are going to be only producing about 5 watts of heat, whereas these produce 7. So basically, if Gigabyte, instead of buying if Gigabyte didn't go with these MOSFETs for this VRM right here, and instead just crammed a bunch of these International Rectifier 3553s in there, this VRM would have been much better. Like, that would also have been a better way of doing this motherboard VRM. So, yeah. I assume that the 3553 is just too expensive, or they couldn't cram as many phases. Maybe? Actually, no, it shouldn't have been an issue, because the only thing they would have had to change would have been which doublers they're using. Like, they would have had to use an International Rectifier 3599 instead of the 3598, and then they would have had a 3553. Yeah, like, it should have been no problem for them to do that. I guess the 3553s at the time were much more expensive than buying a set of discrete MOSFETs. So, yeah. Anyway, VTT VRM you really don't have to worry about. Like, that's great, and it runs passive. And also worth noting is that actually the VTT, you're never going to really, like, 40 amps is really, really high. You're not actually going to see that on that rail. The Intel datasheet basically says maximum current output on that rail is like 24 amps, and this is one of those rails where raising this too high on a Sandybridge-E CPU is a really quick way to kill a Sandybridge-E CPU. So, yeah, no complaints for the VTT. I mean, the system agent VRM is also fine just because it's in the same situation as the VTT rail where it really doesn't need to push that much current. It's just like, it's still much worse than what they have for VTT. And then the memory VRMs are obviously massive overkill. DDR3 does pull more power than DDR4, but with this motherboard only supporting 2 sticks of DDR3, you're really not going to see that much, memory power consumption on here because, yeah, it only has 2 memory sticks maximum, and DDR3 like does pull more than DDR4, but it's not that much more. So the memory VRMs are massive overkill. The VTT and VCCSA are, well, VTT is also really nice. The system agent is not so nice, but adequate, and the vCore is of questionable adequacy. Because, yeah, like, Sandybridge-E will very, very easily hit in this current range, and already in that range, this board's going to have a lot of heat piling up on the back of the board with no cooling, which I'm really not a fan of that. I'm not sure how far Ivybridge-E on LN2 would go, but the thing about running LN2 is that the entire, like, this, when you run LN2, this entire area of the motherboard, more like everything slowly starts to freeze over. So at that point, the VRM cooling becomes more of a case of, will the VRM freeze over and then defrost, and how quickly will it manage to defrost itself afterwards? And, changing ice to water takes a lot of energy. So frozen motherboards don't generally have too many cooling problems. But yeah, for like ambient cooling, this VRM is actually really concerning in my opinion. Because half of it has literally no direct cooling system, so really not a fan of that. Other interesting things about the motherboard, well, you have the buttons, you have the voltage read points, and Gigabyte, like, I love Gigabyte for, like, they used to, well, this is one of the things I love about, like, Gigabyte OC boards, is, like, so you can change the CPU ratio, you can change the BCLK, and you can, this is basically an upgraded version of slow mode, I think, where you can actually have 2 different, like, speed profiles on that gear button, or you can just use it as a normal slow mode switch. Then you, of course, have power, reset switch, and then you have, I think, some BIOS control stuff over on the back of the board there, because the board, of course, being a Gigabyte board, has dual BIOS. So, yeah, and it supports 4-way GPU setups, which is just, like, great. I can run, like, 4-way GTX 480s or something on it for sort of, like, actually, no, 480s weren't relevant, but a 4-way, like, 7970s would have been, like, relevant for the, like, time period correct for the CPUs that go into this motherboard. So, yeah, that's the Gigabyte Ultra Durable 7. Another example of why having a million phases doesn't necessarily translate into a better VRM. Your phases have to individually not suck for them to be good in large quantities, right? Like that's really important. Is like, yeah, you can put 16 phases, but if each individual phase is bloody terrible, then it's like the whole thing is still going to be terrible. So yeah, that's that covers that. That's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, PayPal, t-shirts. You can find a link to all of that down in the description below. That all helps out immensely. And yeah, that's it for the video. So I'm going to have to go look for that stop button and the mouse. Where is the mouse? Oh, right, it's here. Yeah, so that's it. Goodbye.